Hey, Mark, how you doing?
I'm great, Corey. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And you're with the Aristotle Institute or Foundation these days.
I am. So we hope to launch publicly later this year, maybe early 2023. We're going to deal with issues like reason, democracy, civilization, all quite weighty, but we'll break them down over time. And even some of the issues you just talked about, like crime in cities. This is, I think, it's increasingly evidence that crime in cities is eroding, say, the civilization that we have in cities, right? Someone can't walk their dog and in a park without tripping over needles, that sort of thing. So there's a lot to go after these days, I think, and we're going to do that at the Aristotle Foundation for Public Policy.
Great. Well, lots to look forward to. And I see in the meantime, you're still sharing a lot of thoughts. Well, you've released books, of course, a number of them over the years. But the one that caught my eye this time around, though, was that recent one. And this is one I'm sure you got some hot feedback on, but fair enough. And you called a spade, I think, and just saying that some of the people on the right should really stop acting like the left.
Well, the genius of the last 500 years in Western civilization anyway has been that we stop worshiping leaders. The divine right of kings is pretty old now. Nobody takes it seriously. And we don't act like the left, small c conservatives. We don't worship leaders for their own sake and say, only if we get the right leader, then all will be well. It's nice to have the right leader who has some good ideas, but you don't want to rely on that. And the lesson of the last 500 years in Western society, and increasingly around the world, is that institutions matter. So you need the rule of law. You need courts to be independent, so on and so forth. You need to be careful about your rhetoric. Well, historically, the left has been revolutionary. They believe in dear leader, from Lenin to Mao to Venezuela and Hugo Chavez. The left has made these mistakes, really shredding institutions, believing in leaders, using extreme rhetoric, calling Mitt Romney a fascist or a Nazi. About 10 years ago, mild-mannered Mormon Mitt Romney. So the left has often made these mistakes. And there's really no way to sort of help society, correct its errors and move ahead and with good policy. But increasingly, I'm also seeing this on the right. So that's why I wrote the column for the Financial Post. I'm seeing evidence of some of this behavior on what broadly can be construed as the right. People who think of themselves as conservatives or libertarians or what have you.
Yeah, and you brought up some examples. I guess some of it's the hyperbole, the extreme polarization. As you said, when we're calling other leaders, as frustrating as it might be, calling Trudeau a fascist is still too far.
Or a communist.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think highly of Trudeau, and there's many things he can be critiqued for. I think there's a strong streak of authoritarianism within him that's of concern. But when you sort of lose your case when you reach to the very extremes to try and describe somebody.
Well, it's word inflation. If everybody's a fascist or a Nazi or a communist, then what does that mean when you encounter a real Nazi, fascist, or communist, right? So let's get to some clear examples. I think there's been dear leader worship ever since Donald Trump came onto the scene, at least in politics, since 2016. And I think it's abhorrent what happened on January the 6th, so 2021. And I think that showed who Donald Trump was. Nonetheless, even before that, I think there was evidence that here was a fellow who didn't really respect American institutions set up by Thomas Jefferson and others 2.5 centuries ago, or almost 2.5 centuries ago. And so one has to be careful not to take sides, take your own side, so to speak, at face value, and the language these days. So again, look, I think the Emergencies Act was a gross overreaction. It was a violation of civil rights, and by the current federal government. There's no question that shutting in bank accounts and using the Emergencies Act to deal with blockades at the border, the trucker blockades at the border, was a vast overreaction. And I don't agree with the blockades at the border. I didn't in February. I don't now. Those of us on the right who are, we could be considered small c conservative, and I don't mean this in a partisan sense. Those again who kind of hew to conservative ideals, open markets, open trade, the rule of law, the importance of institutions, the importance of civil society, of little platoons, as Edmund Burke called them. You can't cheer on truckers at the border shutting down trade and commerce just because they're on your side and talking about freedom. If you also don't like it when indigenous folk do this, when environmentalists do this to pipelines, when other activists shut down city cores. So I think it helps to be consistent. But I'm seeing increasingly on the right, some even think tank leaders will refer to the prime minister again as a communist or a Nazi, or Premier Kenny as that in Alberta. That's inflationary language is the best way to put it, and it's not helpful. It's also not accurate. Look, again, I have huge concerns. I think the Emergencies Act was a hammer to deal with, trade issues or border issues, border closure issues that obviously could have been dealt with and were dealt with through legislation at Coots. So I think there's been a vast overreaction on all sides, and it doesn't help small C conservatives then to just throw away their brains or their tact or their prudence and join in kind of the crusade of overreacting or using hyped up language. I just don't think that helps.
Well, yeah, and I understand frustration, but it pushes some people to. I had some, well, Twitter's always where I like to sink into the lower depths of debate, but there's some good points. And there was an incident recently with a restaurant where the owner had posed. I guess Justin Trudeau was doing some sort of PR thing there, and he had pictures with Trudeau, and he was swarmed. The restaurant was swarmed on social media. They took his Google reviews all the way down to 0.5 or something, and people went after that business. And I said on Twitter, this is ugly to behold, guys. This isn't the right way to deal with it. You got a problem with Trudeau, fine, but lay off a business owner who had a prime minister visiting. And of course, they were all saying, well, look what happened with Polyev when he went to Steam Whistle. Okay, but two wrongs don't make a right. And that's kind of what the mentality some people are taking on. And that's just making, as I said, two wrongs. We're not benefiting at all when we go that route.
No, and again, I think it shreds the ability to have a reasonable debate or respond appropriately. And again, we don't like it. Those of us who again are, we consider it on the right, and I think those are, very wide general terms. But let's go with it. And I did in my column for the sake of, some context. Those on the right who don't like it when some business is boycotted because they say something on Twitter, or they host a prime minister like former Prime Minister Stephen Harper or something. Nobody likes it when that happens to our side. So yes, I don't think it's helpful to do it to the other side. I mean, like there are egregious instances where you may decide not to work with a business. I mean, maybe if they're engaged in slavery in some third world country, okay, let's boycott that business. But I mean, to jump on the bandwagon, or like you mentioned on Twitter, to attack a restaurant. I mean, this is nuts. I mean, let me give you an example from New York that happened. I think it was about a year and a half ago, where some restaurant. That, I don't know, failed to properly do something on I think it was a Black Lives Matter issue or something. Or no, it was a couple of patrons who happened to be Black showed up at a New York restaurant. And I can't remember if they were asked to put on like proper attire or something. It was more, upper class restaurant or whatever it was. Or maybe they refused seating because they didn't book in advance. I can't remember what it was, but it turned into a cause célèbre for BLM. And the poor restaurant owner, who was just trying to enforce some standards or, book reservations in advance or whatever it was, I don't remember all the details, got attacked on Twitter, same thing as you just mentioned. I mean, it was a vast overreaction. It was unfair to the restaurant owner. But all of a sudden, people are becoming targets. It's a bit of a revolutionary sentiment, actually. And again, on the conservative side, we used to believe that reform mattered, that you take a gradualistic approach to change. It's the Edmund Burke approach. You don't overthrow your monarchy in 1789 like the French do. We don't do this in English-speaking countries. We modify things over time. And I think that's a much better approach. I mean, Canada was founded on a reaction to the revolution in 1776 in the United States. We have plenty of people who said, we don't really appreciate being chased up by, and tarred and feathered in New York and Boston, and who ended up as refugees in what we now call Ontario, Quebec, and Atlantic Canada. I mean, so the history of Canada is a little more, I don't want to use the word moderate. That's a ridiculous word. It doesn't mean anything these days, but a more measured, prudent approach to changing society. So yeah, I think we've got some problems here. And it's not like we have to ignore the issue of freedom. That was the second column you referred to in the National Post that I wrote. We do have a strong history of freedom in this country. And I do have concerns, massive concerns, that it's being eroded. The Emergencies Act was evidence of that. But then let's think smartly how to push back on this kind of stuff. And that's one of the reasons I'm setting up a think tank, and others are helping me and others do this, is because I think there's ways to push back, and we should push back. But let's not imitate the most egregious, extreme measures of the left. I just think that's a recipe for disaster. And in fact, it saves the left from smashing into a brick wall on some of these issues that they should be held to account for.
Yeah, well, and as you pointed out in that second piece, I wanted to talk briefly about that. You're pointing out we have a history of freedom. We, as a people, have a respect and an enjoyment of it, and it is threatened. There's no doubt about that. It's been infringed upon, so we should be concerned and pushing back. But kind of tying these two together, just because it's an important issue doesn't mean you have to pull out all the stops. I mean, in your first piece, you did point out, despite some of the hyperbole, we do have democratic mechanisms to change government, even if it feels frustrating, even if it feels like it's not working at times. Another area where I got into it with a lot of people was when protesters were showing up outside of the mayor's house in Calgary at her private residence. I said, no, I mean, and I'm on Gondek's case all the time. I am no fan of hers, but leave her home alone. And then others are saying, well, the government's infringing on my freedom. I have every right. Look, you are not doing your cause any favors when you go out and do stuff like that, any more than when the left goes in.
You lose the ability to argue that nobody should show up at your place if you err at some point in the future, or someone argues you err at some point in the future. And again, if you're going to pick at the mayor's home, then you can't really complain about Supreme Court justices being picketed in the United States or here one day, or other politicians. Again, this is a very dangerous road to tread. On the freedom issue, again, look, I have great concerns about the erosion of freedom in Canada, which is why I wrote the second column. And so in the first column in the Financial Post, I picked on the right, said, stop acting like the left. In the second column, I said, for those of you who are more liberal, progressive, woke, left-wing, whatever you want to call yourselves, who argue, freedom is just a dog whistle, it doesn't have a tradition in Canada, wrong, it does. We were one of the first countries in the world pre-Confederation to abolish slavery. Governor James Simcoe worked towards that end starting in 1791. It was practically abolished by 1820, before the British Empire even abolished it, long before the Americans abolished slavery. We have a tradition of freedom from John Diefenbaker, the Bill of Rights that he in Parliament passed in 1960, which was an important milestone. And he restored the right to vote to Indigenous Canadians. That was important. Pierre Trudeau, who normally I would disagree with on almost everything, especially economically, Pierre Trudeau, for all his faults, understood that civil rights belong to individuals first. They are not dispensed to you by government. That's an important thing to remind his son of these days, and others on the left, or progressives, or woke. We do have a tradition of freedom. Rights begin with the individual. And Pierre Trudeau was no fan of identity politics. He hated nationalism in Quebec. He didn't like the idea that a small collective, like Quebec nationalists, or a large collective like Quebec nationalists in Quebec, could rule over a small collective English speakers. He hated that. He was in favor of individual rights, and he was eloquent in his defense of individual freedom, although I would disagree with him on some other issues. So we have a tradition of freedom in this country, whether it's James Simcoe, whether it's Wilfrid Laurier, who I mentioned in my column, or even Pierre Trudeau on some issues. That needs to be remembered as well. But I would urge my colleagues, so to speak, in the think tank world, or in journalism and elsewhere, not to use hyperbole. Again, if everybody's a Nazi or a communist or a fascist, then nobody's paying attention when a real version of that comes along.
Able to call it out when we can. I'm not sure if you're getting me clearly. I think we're having a few connection issues here, but we're hearing you quite well. So, okay, well,
I think I've lost you again.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm just having a few connection issues. So before I let you go, where can we keep up with you? You got the Aristotle Foundation on the go, and you publish elsewhere. Where can people see more of your articles and such, Mark?
AristotleFoundation.org, markmilke.com, victimcult.com. So those will all do it. But the AristotleFoundation.com or .ca and markmilke.com, those will get you to where you need to go.
Excellent. Well, thanks for coming in to talk to us today, Mark. They're always good discussions to keep people thinking, even if we don't always all agree on them. So I hope we can talk again soon down the road.
Thank you, Corey.